sweet boy, go now on your journey. I hope it's as good as the trips you dreamed about, because finally, my sweet boy, finally, you're free. I will love you and I will miss you every single day for the rest of my life. But you're right here. I know you're right here. I just have to teach myself how to feel you in a different way. And Hersh, there's one last thing I need you to do for us. Now I need you to help us stay strong. And I need you to help us survive.
Morning glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt inside the Relief Factor studio up north. That was Rachel Goldberg at the funeral of her slain, executed son, Hersh Goldberg-Paulin. You heard Ms. Goldberg on this program about a month ago. Her son, Hersh, an American Israeli citizen, was executed along with 5 others over the weekend. I'm joined from Israel by Haviv Rettig. Good morning, Haviv. Our sorrow for Israel and for the families and everyone, you must know some of these families. It's just the way it works in Israel. I listened to your podcast with Dan Senor. I'd like that you just have the floor for 8 or 9 minutes, if you need it, to describe what is the state of Israel, because it looks pretty fractured to me after this weekend.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of people, these were funerals attended by thousands of people. My wife specifically knows the family of Carmel Gat, who was another one of the hostages executed by Hamas. And there is, 2 things are happening. One, the mourning, which is very powerful and very real, but also there's a sense that it's not clear where the war is going, and it is starting to be. I'll put it this way. On Thursday, the Israeli cabinet had a big debate over whether we, in our negotiations with Hamas, hold on to certain demands, including holding the Egyptian-Gazan border to prevent Hamas from rearming and resupplying as we move forward with the war. If we hold on to that demand in the course of the talks over releasing hostages, it's quite unlikely that we'll get hostages out. And the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, said it's worth it. In other words, we have to squeeze Hamas, choke Hamas, make sure Hamas loses. That is a priority over getting the hostages out. And the defense minister and some of the military chiefs said we can give up this border area called the Philadelphia Corridor, and we'll be able to retake it in the future after the deal. And that's something Netanyahu believes can't happen. So just to sum it up, the Israeli leadership has reached the point, because of the way the war is being run, because of the way Hamas has prioritized holding the hostages over, frankly, saving Gaza from the war continuing, into a very long and extended counterinsurgency. The Israeli cabinet now has to decide whether to let the last hostages potentially die for the war effort, which is agonizing and painful and horrible decision to make, but militarily may well be the right one, that there's a reasonable argument there, or whether it prioritizes a deal to get them out. That
I made them
fight.
Go ahead.
Yeah, please. Well, it came just 2 days before these 6 bodies were then found by troops in the tunnels under Rafah. So there was this agonizing moment before the weekend, and then on Saturday, or I believe maybe Friday night, I don't remember the exact day that the bodies were found, but I think it was on Saturday, the soldiers then came across it, and it just seemed to drive home that the decision, if we go with Netanyahu's decision, and again, it's a reasonable military call, but we're talking about leaving Israelis to die in those tunnels.
So, Haviv, I made the mistake of watching one of the execution videos of Hamas, and they're evil beyond evil. How in the world does giving one concession, any kind of concession, to these murdering evil people, especially Sinwar, how does any Israeli believe that will lead to the release of any hostage? I can't believe it.
We probably can get 30 hostages out if we give enough. There are 30 hostages that Hamas can give. We have names of most of them. It's also, we had a deal in November where Hamas let out to something like, I forget what it was, 10 a day for 7 days. Plus, that's the Israelis. There were also, I think, 40 or some number of foreigners that it had taken, agricultural workers who were just in the kibbutzim that Hamas raided, but Hamas didn't actually target them. It still held on to them until the first deal was struck in November. So it's not that we can't get 30 out. It is quite likely that we can. The question is the cost, and that's where Israelis are deeply divided. I have to tell you, it's not just, people saw the mass protests yesterday. Those are mass protests against Netanyahu and against the decision to prioritize the next 6 weeks, or the first 6 weeks of a deal, when we would have to pull out of the Philadelphia corridor, out of the border area, to prioritize the military question over the hostages. But Israelis, we know from polls, are deeply divided within each individual. In other words, the majority of Israelis, polls tell us, polls from the weekend tell us, the majority of Israelis oppose leaving the Philadelphia corridor. And the majority of Israelis support a deal. And there is no deal probably with Hamas without leaving the Philadelphia corridor. And so it is absolutely a divide around Netanyahu. But it is a divide within every single Israeli soul as well. And the question of Sinwar, I'll put it very simply. Hamas are monsters. And what's astonishing to me about the discussion in the West is pro-Palestinian people don't seem to have enough of a grasp of what's happening to understand the scale of how much Hamas are monsters for the Palestinians. In other words, Hamas's strategy is to force the destruction of Gaza. It built 500 miles of tunnels for that very purpose. In 11 months of war, not a single Palestinian civilian has been allowed to step a single foot in any tunnel just to protect themselves. The point for Hamas is mass civilian deaths in Gaza, and it first built 500 miles of tunnels to force a war that cuts through cities, and then carried out October 7 to leave the Israelis no choice. And you can think Israelis are monsters, but that makes Hamas even more monstrous, because that means that Hamas knew that what would come on Gaza would be disastrous. And in fact, we have intelligence information and leaks and things found in Gaza that tell us that Hamas leadership is a little bit frustrated that the death toll in Gaza isn't vastly higher. And so this whole question of Hamas being monsters, of Hamas dangling hostages in front of us, of Hamas trying to extend the war for as long as humanly possible, of them hoping Gaza doesn't recover and the war doesn't end for a very long time. I don't know how you can support Palestinians and not find that monstrous, and I certainly don't know how you can support Israelis. I mean, people support the Israelis do find it monstrous, obviously. So yes, they are the destroyers of their own society, and also absolutely devoted to murdering every last one of us.
And when I listen to the hostage videos, it seems to me Sinwar now has a very calculated, cruelest strategy I have ever seen, which is to, regardless of what Israel does, execute hostages on video. And what I'm trying to articulate, and we got to go to break, and we'll talk about it during the break, is that this seems to me like a Munich moment for Israel, and 300,000 people want Netanyahu to sign the Munich Agreement, as Chamberlain did with Hitler. And so 300,000 Israelis want Netanyahu, and I don't get involved in domestic politics of other countries. They want him to trust Sinwar, that Sinwar will follow through and not just murder more people. And given what we saw, the execution of hostages after Blinken said Netanyahu accepted every part of the bridging proposal, would be, to me, and I'll give you 30 seconds and you'll hear the music. We got to go to a break and come back. It'd be insane. I don't understand the 300,000 people, what they expect to happen.
Just to put it very, very simply and briefly, they are not thinking that Netanyahu needs to give everything. Very few Israelis think there should not be any red lines in the hostage negotiations, but they don't trust Netanyahu. They don't trust Netanyahu to be making any of these decisions on who lives and who dies honestly and not connected to his politics and his campaign. And that's what you saw in those protests. People who say, you're calling on people to die and you're lying to us about it, and we don't know that you're making these decisions cleanly and not to save your coalition. So it's not a debate about hostage talks. It's a debate. There's not a fundamental difference between people on the center left. It's a debate about trust.
I will be right back with Haviv during the break. We'll put it all in the podcast, play it tomorrow. Then he's coming back on the other side of the break, and we'll do it 4 segments with Haviv today. They'll all be on highly concentrated Hugh podcast later in the day. Stay tuned, America. I'm back now with Haviv Rettig. Haviv, we've got about 4 minutes in this inter segment part. When I saw the 300,000 people, I thought to myself, they are exploiting the execution of 6 hostages, including 1 American hostage, to continue their campaign against Netanyahu. In other words, not all of them, but the 300,000 who demonstrated against the judicial reform, voted against Netanyahu. And I don't understand how anyone can take to this, no matter how much they hate Netanyahu, after the execution, how the country couldn't mourn first. I'm really kind of stunned that Israel would think it was a political moment as opposed to a mourning moment. Am I just on a different planet?
Well, I did say Netanyahu has a reasonable military argument, so and I think he does. But the question is that the excuse or is that the reason? And it's a valid question when you start to look at how he has generally managed the war. There's a sense among Israelis that the war is not actually going well, that it's dragging out, that the hard decisions aren't being made. You can defeat Hamas 1,000 times if you don't replace the civilian elements governing Gaza, which are also Hamas, and if you don't, have some answer to UNRWA and to how foreign aid flows in. If you seal Philadelphia and they can't resupply, but the massive foreign aid operation is still supplying people on the ground who work for Hamas, then UNRWA becomes the path for Hamas's salvation, even as Israel destroys, the military wing and controls Philadelphia. So a lot of political decisions have to be made. Who governs Gaza after the war is a decision the Israelis already had to make. And this government's inability for political reasons to make calls, difficult calls, painful calls, calls that there are no easy answers or right answers. But nevertheless, you're the government. You're supposed to make those calls. You don't want to make difficult calls. Don't be prime minister. And his refusal to make those calls because he'll lose the far right of his coalition, his government might fall, has meant that the war drags on. Soldiers die, hostages are stuck in these tunnels, Palestinian civilians are dying, and there's no horizon. There's no sense that we're going toward some clear goal or strategy that he can articulate. He has gone over the last 11 months, something like 3 months at a time, without giving a single interview to the Israeli press. He gave a big press presentation yesterday to Israelis to try and explain to them what he's thinking about the Philadelphia corridor and why it's important. It was the first in months, and right-wing defenders of him said that on Twitter. Where have you been for months while people thought you were lying to them and failing the war? And I'll just say one last data point to understand the scale of distrust and where it comes from and why it is reasonable as well. Kibbutz Nir Oz is one of the kibbutzim hit by Hamas. A quarter of its residents were killed or kidnapped on October 7. And Netanyahu has refused to visit. It's a left-voting kibbutz, and he thinks that it'll produce bad images for the political campaign. So he won't go. Now, if you are the center-left voter of Tel Aviv, most of the people taken hostage are left-wing voters. They're not Netanyahu voters. It's hard to see that kind of behavior systematically. I myself, my wife has worked with some families of hostages to help their campaign in the world. And a family that she has accompanied managed to get a meeting with the Chancellor of Germany before a meeting with the most junior of Israeli ministers. So to the center left, to ordinary people who see these things, it looks like we are ruled by a government that doesn't care that people who aren't their voters are sitting in dungeons in Gaza. Now, I don't think that's
let me come back.
What's going through Netanyahu's head, but that's the response. It's a response to that sense of distance, that sense that he doesn't care, that sense that it's all campaign, even while people are suffering and sacrificing.
I'm coming right back on the national show. Don't go anywhere, Haviv. Got a big question to follow up on that. Stand by. I'm back now with Haviv Rettig of the Times of Israel, the most objective, the most, I think, balanced observer of Israel policy that I listen to regularly on Dan Senor's podcast. Haviv, the last thing Americans saw, Secretary Blinken was with Netanyahu, and Secretary Blinken declared that Netanyahu had accepted every paragraph of the bridging proposal. I assume that the Philadelphia corridor maps that he produced at the controversial cabinet meeting were the maps that Blinken agreed to. Why blame him? I just really don't understand what the demonstrators want him to do, even if they've got members of the military telling them we can leave the corridor and return to the corridor at will. It seems to me that you're negotiating against yourself. And then they executed 6 people after Israel accepted the bridging agreement. I don't know how anyone could believe anything Sinwar says.
So the map Netanyahu presented in the cabinet meeting on Thursday night, apparently, according to cabinet leaks from the cabinet. Now, it's illegal to leak from the security cabinet. So these leaks are political acts that are illegal, and it happens all the time. But nevertheless, it is a little bit dangerous, and you have to understand them as people maneuvering in public, right? So just take it with a grain of salt as a political act. Nevertheless, the leaks that have not been contested from the cabinet meeting say that the maps Netanyahu presented were actually new, not the maps drawn up by the defense ministry and the army. Surprised the chief of staff of the army who was sitting in the meeting, surprised the defense minister who was sitting in the meeting, and Netanyahu called a rush vote on it so that they couldn't respond or go back to staff work or anything like that. So it was not a situation where it was some agreed upon, serious, thought out. It was Netanyahu ambushing the defense establishment to pass this. If you are a person who does not already trust Netanyahu and vote for Netanyahu, you might well come out of that kind of a report, which again is not contested by anyone at the meeting, and say, well, Netanyahu actually changed what the Israeli proposal was or what he had agreed to in order to make a deal more difficult. In other words, he's avoiding a deal. Why is he avoiding a deal? Because the two parties to the right of Likud, Ben Gvir's party and Smotrich's party, have threatened to leave the coalition. In other words, for his political survival, he is preventing a deal from being signed. That is a belief.
Is it not possible, though, that
Israelis.
The way I read that, and I just wanted to specifically ask this, I think he put those maps forward so that Biden and whoever is running the White House, is not Joe Biden, the poor guy has just lost it, but whoever is running the White House doesn't change the terms again, because every time Israel's accepted a deal and Hamas says no, the Americans come back, Blinken, Sullivan, Lloyd Austin, and say, you've got to give more. I think he did those maps just to make sure that Blinken didn't change the deal again, and then Hamas executed 6 people. Is that possible?
Presenting maps and making a demand on Philadelphia. Okay, let me take a step back because it's really important. I said this before, but let me say it again because it's really important to understand. Netanyahu says we can't leave Philadelphia at all, no matter what, that Gaza-Egypt border, because Hamas will simply rearm and resupply, and it'll be a much more difficult and longer war, more painful for Gaza, more painful for our soldiers. We have polls on this. A large majority of Israelis, I think it's 62% to, I don't know what the other side is, something like 25%. A huge majority supports staying in Philadelphia. And that's important to say. Israelis support staying on that corridor. A large majority of Israelis, also in the upper 60s, according to a poll on Friday on Channel 12, support a deal. How do you support a deal but also support staying in the very border area that prevents a deal? Israelis, voters want it all, right? Voters want a lot of entitlements and a low deficit, right? Voters, but it isn't that Israelis don't support the idea of Philadelphia, including people protesting. It's that they don't trust Netanyahu. And so we have another set of polls. Channel 12 on Friday asked Israelis, do you think this should be Netanyahu's last term? 69% yes. And I believe it was 12% he should run again, or it might have gone up to 20% he should run again. And then they asked coalition voters, in other words, people who voted for his government, for the parties in his government, and it was 46 to 42. most of his own vote, a plurality of his own voters, don't want him to seek another term. So two things are happening all at once. You're
No,
concerned
actually,
about
we're
Philadelphia.
going to go to break.
Basic logic
Five things
makes
are
sense.
happening. Five things are happening
Yes.
all at once. And I think people have got to keep it in mind that the one thing that hasn't changed is Sinwar is a monster. And I don't think he intends to leave Gaza alive. And I don't think he intends to do anything except break Israel. But I'll ask one more segment with Haviv coming up about the American role in all this. Stay tuned, America. I'll put it on the podcast. Back now for one more segment with Haviv Rettig Gore. Haviv, over the weekend, Great Britain announced their new left-wing government that it is barring arms sales to Israel, or something very close to a complete, absolute bar. I have said, and this is not Haviv's opinion, it's Hugh Hewitt's opinion, Kamala Harris represents what would be the first anti-Israel president should she win. I don't think she's going to win, but I think she would be anti-Israel, not just the least supportive American president ever. Do the people in the streets understand the impact on the American election right now and on the frozen nature of our politics? We can't help you in any way. We can only hurt you at this point. Do they understand that?
I think there's a lot of frustration among Israelis, and you hear it from Israelis who lean Republican, and you hear it from Israelis who lean Democrat. Israelis are distant and speak Hebrew and don't have a good sense of the exact culture war in America. But in as much as they will support Trump more or Biden or Harris more, they share a frustration, and the frustration is, America is a huge factor in the fight happening now in Israeli politics about the future of the war, because Netanyahu says, if I pull out of Philadelphia, I can't go back in after the 42 days of the agreement in which 30 hostages come out, and then we go back to the war. Well, what if I can't go back to the war? What if I can't go back into Philadelphia because the Americans won't let me? That's the argument. So without an American pressure to constantly reduce and slow the war effort, we'd be much farther along, and
Yes.
we would cut the time in which everybody has to suffer, especially Palestinians. In other words, there's a confusion to American policy that seems to a lot of Israelis, including Israelis who lean left in American terms, to be just messing things up and making everything worse.
So my last question, Haviv, do they understand the stakes of our election? The executions rattled Americans. It rattled me because I thought Sinwar might be preparing an exit strategy to save his own skin and get to Iran. It's clear to me now he's not. You don't execute 6 people after Israel accepts the bridging proposal. You decide we're going to be martyrs in these tunnels, and you say, kill us all, but we'll kill a lot of you first. That's just how I view it. And I don't understand, other than rank politics on the part of a lot of those 300,000 people. Some are grieving, some hate Netanyahu, but I just think it's rank politics to call a general strike after that and blame Netanyahu after he accepted the Blinken proposal. Last word to you, Haviv.
So, just one word on the Israeli political angle, and then something much more important on Sinwar. 40% of Israelis think Netanyahu is campaigning, and his war decisions are campaign. Netanyahu created that distrust. I don't think it's that bad, but I do think he caused the distrust that we are all now suffering from. So you cannot lead a country with the kind of predatory distrust, politicking that you can have in peacetime, that you can afford in peacetime. You need trust to ask people to die and to ask people to sacrifice. And so we are suffering, and I blame Netanyahu, even when I don't accept the left's worst critiques of Netanyahu. So just that's it for that. Sinwar, very, very critical to say. Here's the silver lining. He's burning every bridge. You don't burn bridges if you think you have a way out. You don't burn bridges if you think you can turn anything around. That, to me, strengthens the argument for staying in Philadelphia. And that's one reason I think that a lot of Israelis have a good sense that Philadelphia is critical, even those who don't trust Netanyahu, and even those who think we need to get a deal to get whoever we can out. By the way, it also means whoever we don't get out soon doesn't come out. But Hamas is
on that note, Haviv, I agree completely with that assessment, that if there is a deal to be done that doesn't oblige Israel to leave either of its corridors or commit to an end of operations against Hamas, do it, no matter what the cost. But I don't trust Sinwar at all. And I think, the last season of Fauda that most Americans saw, the most dreaded thing was being sent to Iran. And I do believe that if you leave the corridor, those hostages will go underneath it. 30 seconds. Do you agree with me?
I think going to Iran is a bad thing. It's possible we have better intelligence in Egypt and on the path to Iran than we do in Gaza, but nevertheless, it's a terrible thing. But I mainly think they'll be killed. Hamas is losing its capacity to do clever things, and so their lives are in absolute immediate mortal danger.
Good Lord. We pray for them, and we thank you, Haviv. It's always calming and very enlightening to talk to you. Thank you for your time this morning. Haviv Rettig Gur can be found at Times of Israel.